I paid for a family trip, but my sister tried to take control. I did something that caused chaos. Hello, read it. Vacations were supposed to be a time of relaxation, a break from the exhaustion of routine life. For most families, they meant adventure, quality time, and new experiences. For mine, however, vacations had always been an unspoken battleground, one that I had spent my entire adult life trying to avoid. Because in my family, vacations were never about fun. They were about Emily. My name is Aaron, and I'm 28 years old. I have worked tirelessly to build a stable and comfortable life for myself, away from the chaos that is my family. I come from a middle-class background, where money was never abundant, but somehow always made available to my older sister whenever she wanted something. It wasn't that my parents were wealthy, but rather that they prioritized Emily's happiness over everything else, sometimes even their own well-being, and certainly over mine. For as long as I can remember, Emily has been the center of our family's universe. She has a way of bending reality to her will, manipulating every situation to ensure she gets what she wants. She isn't outwardly cruel, but she has this entitlement, this deep-seated belief that the world should accommodate her. And unfortunately, my parents reinforced that belief at every turn. When I was a kid, I thought it was normal. I thought every little brother was expected to give up his toys because his sister deserved them more. I thought it was standard for family outings to be planned around her preferences while my interests were dismissed as trivial. I thought it was fair that she got brand new clothes and electronics while I received hand-me-downs and lectures about the value of hard work. Then I grew up, and I saw the pattern for what it was. Emily was the golden child, and I was the afterthought. But I wasn't bitter about it. Not at first anyway. I had long accepted that I would always have to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition she did. That was just the way it was. But over time, the resentment settled in, layer by layer, like sediment at the bottom of a river. I moved out at 18, scraping by with part-time jobs while juggling college. I never asked my parents for help. Meanwhile, Emily bounced between failed jobs and relationships, living at home rent-free. And every time she needed money, my parents provided. Every time she failed at something, they made excuses. Every time she demanded more, they complied without hesitation. For years, I told myself it didn't matter. I built my own life, made my own money. I never relied on anyone. But when it came to family events, the imbalance was still there. Emily made the plans, Emily made the rules, and everyone followed. It was easier that way. At least, that's what my parents always said. Then, about 6 months ago, I decided to do something nice for my family. After working tirelessly for years, I had finally landed a high-paying job. It was the kind of success I had dreamed of but never thought I would actually achieve. And with that success came a desire to celebrate. So I planned a surprise. A fully paid vacation. I spent months picking out the perfect destination, booking luxury accommodations, and covering every detail. I wanted this to be the trip of a lifetime, a chance to create memories that didn't revolve around Emily's needs. It was my way of giving back to my family, a grand gesture to show them how far I had come. I paid for everything: flights, hotels, activities, meals. It was an expensive undertaking, but I didn't care. My parents were thrilled. Even my extended family, usually distant, was excited. It felt good, knowing that for once, I was the one bringing everyone together. And then Emily found out. At first, she seemed indifferent. She dismissed my choices, claiming the destination was boring and the accommodations weren't up to her standards. But as the weeks went by, I started noticing a shift. Her criticisms became sharper, more aggressive. She wanted changes, lots of them. She demanded we alter the itinerary to suit her preferences. She insisted that certain activities be replaced. And, most audaciously, she declared that her boyfriend, a man none of us particularly liked, had to be included. I pushed back. I told her that I had planned this trip as a gift, that I had already finalized everything, that there was no room for additional guests. That's when she lost it. She ranted about how selfish I was, how I had blindsided the family by making decisions without consulting her. She painted herself as the victim, spinning a narrative where I was the villain who had purposefully excluded her from the planning process. She went to my parents, crocodile tears in her eyes, and suddenly they were telling me to reconsider. They asked me to compromise, to be reasonable. And then Emily did the unthinkable. She told me I wasn't allowed to go on the trip I had paid for. It was absurd, laughable even, but in my family, her word had always been law. My parents, though hesitant, sided with her. They pleaded with me to let her have more control, to change things to her liking. They even suggested I step back and let Emily take charge of the trip entirely, since she was better at handling these things. I was stunned. I had paid for everything. This was my gift to them. And yet, Emily had somehow twisted it into something she controlled. She believed she had the power to exclude me from my own generosity. That's when I made my decision. I canceled her ticket. Not just her ticket, but her boyfriend's as well. And I didn't tell her. I simply let the days pass, pretending everything was normal. I watched as she smugly issued commands, certain that she was running the show. I let my parents believe I had given in, that I had surrendered like I always did. And then, the day of the flight arrived. We all went to the airport. Emily, as usual, was running late, barking orders through the family group chat. And as we stood at the gate, ready to board, she finally arrived, only to be told her ticket was invalid. The realization hit her like a freight train. She screamed, she demanded, she threatened. But there was nothing she could do. The gates closed. The plane took off. And for the first time in my life, I watched my family go on a trip where Emily wasn't in control. For the first time, I had won, and the fallout was worse than I ever imagined. The flight was peaceful. It was strange, really. Every family trip I had ever been on had been filled with tension, with last-minute changes to accommodate Emily's whims. But this time, without her presence, there was an unfamiliar stillness. For the first time, the itinerary remained unchanged. The atmosphere wasn't dictated by her moods, and no one was walking on eggshells to prevent an inevitable meltdown. But beneath the surface, I could feel the weight of what had happened. My parents sat stiffly in their seats, their expressions vacant as they stared out of the airplane windows. They weren't talking to me, but I knew their minds were consumed by the same thought. Emily had been left behind, and in their eyes, I was to blame. The moment the plane landed, I turned on my phone and braced myself. The flood of missed calls and messages confirmed what I already knew. Emily was unraveling. The first few texts were scattered with confusion, asking why her ticket wasn't working and demanding an explanation. Then came the anger. Long, unhinged paragraphs filled with accusations and insults. Threats mixed with desperate pleas. Claims that I had ruined everything, that I had humiliated her in front of the family, that I was nothing but a jealous and vindictive person who had been waiting for the chance to betray her. I ignored them. Arriving at the resort should have been a relief. The air was warm. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the horizon. And for once, there was no one barking orders about what needed to change. The hotel was perfect, just as I had planned. Everything was seamless, efficient, and calm. But the silence from my parents weighed on me like a thick fog, one that refused to lift no matter how much I tried to shake it off. They were upset, but it wasn't anger that simmered beneath the surface. It was disappointment. To them, I had committed the ultimate betrayal, not against Emily, but against the delicate balance of the family dynamic. For years, they had navigated life by keeping Emily placated, by giving in, by sacrificing whatever they needed to in order to keep her from unraveling. And I had just shattered that system. The tension reached its peak during dinner. While my extended family chatted and laughed, my parents sat in uncomfortable silence, barely touching their food. The weight of their disapproval pressed against me, though I refused to acknowledge it. They wanted me to break first, to explain myself, to offer an apology they believed was inevitable. But I had nothing to apologize for. For years, I had been the one making sacrifices. I had been the one putting my own needs aside, the one compromising to keep the peace. I had bent so many times I barely recognized myself anymore. And this time, I had finally done something for myself. something that didn't revolve around Emily's never-ending expectations. That night, when I checked my phone again, I saw that Emily had taken her anger beyond private messages. She had gone public. Her social media post painted a dramatic and carefully curated version of events, one that made her the wounded victim of a cruel and calculated act. She told her followers, friends, and distant relatives that I had intentionally excluded her from the family trip out of pettiness and jealousy. She wrote about how I had always resented her, how I had taken advantage of my financial success to control everyone, how I had humiliated her in front of the people she loved. The comments flooded in, all taking her side. Messages of sympathy, of outrage, of pure disbelief that a sibling could do something so heartless. Friends who had never met me called me manipulative. Distant relatives who hadn't spoken to us in years declared that they had always known there was something cruel about me. Acquaintances who barely knew Emily swarmed to comfort her, feeding into the narrative she had spun so effortlessly. The realization hit hard. No matter how much I had tried to escape it, Emily still had control. She controlled the way people saw her. She controlled the story they believed. And once again, I was the villain in a story that only she had the power to tell. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. Rationally, I knew I shouldn't care. I knew Emily was manipulative, that she could twist any situation to fit the narrative that suited her. But seeing it all laid out like that, watching the waves of people turn against me so quickly, made my skin crawl. It didn't stop there. Emily wasn't content with just social media. She called every family member she could, crying into the phone, telling them how I had humiliated her, how I had abandoned her, how she had been left behind like she was nothing. One by one, the calls started coming in. Some were from relatives demanding to know what had happened, others from family members who spoke in disappointed tones, quietly suggesting that I had taken things too far. My parents were the last to confront me. Their disappointment was thick, their exhaustion evident. They had spent years enabling Emily, years allowing her to dictate the course of their lives. And now they were faced with the uncomfortable reality of what that had created. But instead of acknowledging that truth, they clung to the one thing they could still hold on to, the idea that this could somehow be fixed. They wanted me to apologize. They wanted me to call Emily, to tell her it had been a mistake, to offer her another trip to make up for what I had done. They wanted me to undo it all, as if it had never happened, as if Emily hadn't tried to cut me out of the very trip I had paid for. I refused. The weight of their disappointment settled deep in my chest, but I didn't waver. I had spent my entire life sacrificing, conceding, compromising. And now that I had finally stood my ground, they wanted me to undo it? They wanted me to go back to being the person who always bent, always yielded, always folded under the pressure of Emily's demands? Not this time. I went to bed that night feeling exhausted, but something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just angry anymore. I wasn't just frustrated or resentful. I was done. Emily could rage. She could spin her version of events however she wanted. She could call every friend, every relative, every mutual acquaintance, and turn them against me. But I wasn't playing along anymore. And that was something she had never expected. The morning after the confrontation with my parents, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating aggressively on the nightstand. The notifications had not stopped. Emily's social media meltdown had escalated overnight, reaching a point I hadn't anticipated. She had gone beyond portraying herself as the victim of a cruel exclusion. Now, she was rewriting history itself. She had begun to claim that I had been emotionally abusive for years, that I had always sought to undermine her, that I had manipulated our parents into favoring me, that I had spent years trying to turn the family against her. She crafted a story where I had been the spoiled, selfish one, always scheming to make her look bad while she, the innocent and caring older sister, had tried her best to keep the family together. And people believed her. The comments had evolved from simple outrage to outright hostility. Strangers, people who didn't even know me, were calling me a narcissist, a control freak, a toxic influence. Some were even sending direct messages filled with insults and veiled threats. A few suggested that my family should cut ties with me completely. Emily had always been a master of twisting narratives, but this was something else entirely. This was an all-out campaign to destroy my reputation, to turn everyone against me, to make sure that no matter what happened next, I would be the villain in everyone's eyes. And she wasn't done. As I scrolled through the barrage of messages, I found a new development, one that made my blood run cold. Emily had posted screenshots of text messages, but they weren't real. They were altered, fabricated conversations that made it look as though I had been taunting her for weeks. The text she had posted made it seem like I had planned this exclusion months in advance, that I had been cruel and vindictive long before the trip had even been booked. She had even faked messages where I had supposedly mocked her for being left behind, rubbing it in her face that she wasn't invited. I had expected retaliation, but I hadn't expected this. I knew confronting her directly was useless. Emily thrived on conflict, and any attempt to call her out would only add fuel to her fire. If I tried to expose her, she would find a way to twist it into further evidence of my supposed cruelty. My parents had been silent all morning. When I finally stepped out of my hotel room, they were waiting. My mother's eyes were red and puffy from crying. My father looked exhausted, his face lined with disappointment. They didn't say much, but their silence spoke volumes. They had seen Emily's posts. They believed them. It didn't matter how much I had done for them, how much I had sacrificed, how much I had tried to keep the peace over the years. The moment Emily positioned herself as the victim, they had defaulted to their usual stance: protect her at all costs. The rest of the family was divided. Some of my extended relatives had seen through Emily's manipulations and supported me, but others were hesitant, unsure of what to believe. The damage was already being done, and I could feel the fractures widening beneath the surface. But Emily wasn't finished. By midday, I received a message from my landlord. Confused, I opened it, and my stomach dropped. Emily had contacted them. Somehow, she had spun a sob story, telling them that I was an aggressive, unstable individual who had a history of violent outbursts. She implied that I had mistreated her for years and that she was worried for my neighbors. She even hinted that she was concerned about my mental state, as if I was some kind of ticking time bomb. I stared at the message, my hands shaking with rage. Emily wasn't just trying to ruin my reputation. She was trying to ruin my life. If she could get me evicted, she would. If she could push me out of the family completely, she would. If she could destroy everything I had worked for, she wouldn't hesitate. And the worst part? My parents still wanted me to be the one to apologize. They pulled me aside that evening, their voices hushed but urgent. They told me that the situation had gotten out of control, that I needed to fix this. They told me that Emily was suffering, that she was spiraling, that she was devastated over what I had done. They didn't care about the lies, about the false messages, about the fact that she was actively trying to ruin my life. All they cared about was keeping Emily from feeling like she had lost. They wanted me to call her. They wanted me to beg for forgiveness. They wanted me to undo everything, to offer her another trip, to let her rewrite the story however she wanted, just to keep the family intact. And I realized something in that moment. Emily would always win, not because she was smarter, not because she was stronger, not because she was right, but because my parents would always choose her. It didn't matter what she did. It didn't matter how much she lied, how much she manipulated, how much she tried to destroy me. She would always come first. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight Emily anymore. I wasn't going to argue or defend myself or try to get my parents to see the truth. I was going to walk away, not just from the situation, not just from the vacation, from them. Emily had spent her entire life controlling the family, controlling the narrative, controlling every aspect of our lives. She thrived on the chaos, on the conflict, on the endless cycle of pushing and pulling until everyone was too exhausted to fight back. But I wasn't playing anymore. I booked an earlier flight home. I packed my bags without a word. I walked through the lobby of the resort, past my stunned family, past my parents' pleading expressions, past the weight of expectations that had held me down for so many years. I didn't owe them an explanation. I didn't owe them my silence. I didn't owe them anything. For the first time in my life, I was free. And as I stepped onto the plane, leaving them behind, I knew one thing for certain. Emily would never stop. But now, she had no one left to fight. And that, more than anything, would destroy her. The plane ride home should have felt like a relief. I had finally walked away from a family dynamic that had suffocated me for years. I had broken free from Emily's control, from the endless cycle of manipulation and forced apologies. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was a strange, hollow numbness. It wasn't regret. It wasn't sadness. It was the weight of years of exhaustion finally settling in. For so long, I had told myself that things would eventually get better, that one day my parents would see Emily for who she truly was. But deep down, I had always known the truth. There was no breaking free from her unless I removed myself entirely. And now that I was left wondering what life would even look like without that constant fight. The plane landed, and I turned my phone back on, bracing myself for what I knew was coming. The moment the notifications started flooding in, I realized that whatever I had been expecting, it was much worse. Emily hadn't just continued her campaign against me. She had escalated to a level I didn't think even she was capable of. She had rewritten the story entirely. Now, in the version she was spreading, I hadn't just excluded her from the vacation. I had abandoned our parents in a foreign country. She claimed they had been left stranded, helpless, with no money or support, while I heartlessly boarded a plane home without a care. She spun the tale so convincingly that even people who had known me for years were beginning to believe her. The messages were brutal. Longtime friends, relatives I barely spoke to, even acquaintances from years ago, all of them were condemning me. Some of them were subtle, sending passive-aggressive texts about family values and how no matter what happens, you don't turn your back on your blood. Others were more direct, calling me selfish, manipulative, a disgrace. But the worst part? My parents still weren't correcting the narrative. They had let Emily run wild with her version of events, and their silence was damning. It confirmed what I had always known. When forced to choose between Emily's lies and the truth, they would always choose her. For the first time in my life, I felt completely alone. I spent the next few days in isolation, ignoring the messages, the calls, the relentless attempts to drag me back into the cycle. I knew exactly what my parents wanted. They wanted me to fix this. They wanted me to call Emily, to apologize, to let her rewrite the story however she pleased so that the family could return to its normal state. But I refused. Then, something unexpected happened. A family member who had always remained neutral reached out. Someone who had never taken sides, never gotten involved in the chaos. And for the first time, they spoke up. Emily had gone too far. They had been watching from a distance, staying silent while everyone else had chosen sides. But now, they had noticed something important. Emily's story didn't add up. She had told different versions of the events to different people. To some, she claimed my parents were stranded in a foreign country with no money, left completely helpless. To others, she insisted that I had abandoned them at the airport, walking away while they begged me to stay. And to a select few, she exaggerated even further, saying I had physically threatened her before leaving. The inconsistencies were beginning to show. People were starting to compare notes. Doubt was creeping in. Some of the relatives who had originally sided with her were now questioning everything. The cracks in Emily's carefully curated narrative were starting to widen. But that wasn't even the worst of it. A mutual acquaintance reached out with something even more damning. Emily had been trying to gain access to my bank accounts. Somehow, she had convinced my parents that since I had cut myself off from the family, I no longer needed the financial resources I had. With their support, she had been making calls to banks, pretending to be me, attempting to gain access to my accounts. She had even gone as far as trying to reset my passwords, using personal details she had gathered over the years. She wasn't just trying to ruin my reputation anymore. She was trying to ruin my life. That was the final straw. I had spent my entire life trying to keep the peace. I had sacrificed, compromised, allowed myself to be pushed around, all for the sake of family. But this was beyond manipulation. This was calculated destruction. And I wasn't going to let it happen. I gathered every piece of evidence I had. Every fake text she had posted, every manipulated social media post, every voicemail, every message. I compiled proof of her attempts to access my financial accounts. I documented everything, organizing it into a comprehensive, indisputable case. Then, I contacted a lawyer. Emily had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable, that no matter what she did, my parents would always protect her, that she could ruin lives without consequence. But she had underestimated me. I wasn't going to fight her in the way she expected. I wasn't going to argue, or beg, or plead with my parents to see the truth. I was going to take legal action, and this time, there was nothing she could do to stop me. The next morning, I filed formal complaints against her for identity fraud and attempted financial theft. I sent cease and desist letters for the defamation, warning her that if she continued spreading lies about me, I would escalate things further. Emily had played a dangerous game, assuming I would never fight back. But now, the game was over, and for the first time in her life, she was about to face real consequences. The moment the legal papers were filed, everything changed. Emily had spent her life manipulating people, controlling the family, rewriting reality to suit her. But the law wasn't something she could twist to her advantage. It was cold, unforgiving, unaffected by her crocodile tears and false narratives. At first, she didn't take it seriously. She ran it online about how I had turned against my own family, portraying herself as the innocent victim of a calculated attack. She claimed I was trying to ruin her life out of spite, painting me as some power-hungry monster desperate for revenge. She pleaded with her followers for sympathy, doubling down on her lies, insisting that I had abandoned my parents and now was trying to destroy her. But this wasn't social media. This was real life, and Emily wasn't prepared for real consequences. When the cease and desist letters arrived, she ignored them at first. My lawyer made it clear, if she didn't take down the post defaming me, I would escalate to a full lawsuit. If she continued trying to access my financial accounts, I would press criminal charges. And for the first time in her life, Emily panicked. She called my parents, wailing about how I was ruining everything. She swore up and down that it was all a misunderstanding, that she had never actually meant to do anything, that she had just been emotional and didn't think her actions through. But the law didn't care about her excuses. And neither did I. My parents begged me to reconsider. They pleaded for mercy. They tried to frame this as a family dispute that had gotten out of hand, something that could be resolved with a few heartfelt apologies. But I wasn't falling for it. This wasn't just about a vacation. This wasn't just about lies and manipulation. This was about theft, fraud, defamation. Emily had gone too far, and now she was paying the price. The panic in her voice was evident when she finally tried to contact me directly. It wasn't the usual arrogance, the usual entitlement. There was no anger, no demands, only desperation. She left voicemails, long rambling messages about how she didn't mean for things to get this bad, how she just wanted to feel included, how she never thought I'd actually go this far. But I didn't respond, because I knew the truth. Emily wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry she got caught. Her legal troubles were just beginning, and as the weight of reality set in, I watched her carefully crafted world crumble around her. Relatives who had initially taken her side started to distance themselves. Friends who had believed her lies began realizing they had been manipulated. Slowly but surely, the web of deceit she had spun started to unravel. And my parents? They were lost. For the first time in their lives, they were forced to face something they had spent years avoiding. The reality that their golden child was not the person they had always convinced themselves she was. They had spent decades enabling her, protecting her, making excuses for her behavior. And now, as the consequences came crashing down, they had no idea how to handle it. They begged me to drop the case. They swore Emily had learned her lesson, that she was scared straight. They tried every emotional trick in the book, guilt, nostalgia, even outright denial, pretending that it wasn't as serious as I was making it out to be. But I stood firm, because this wasn't just about Emily anymore. This was about me reclaiming my life. For the first time ever, I wasn't backing down. I wasn't conceding, wasn't compromising, wasn't bending over backward to keep the peace. And it felt liberating. In the end, Emily was forced to comply. She took down every post. She sent out half-hearted clarifications that didn't quite admit she had lied, but were enough to defuse the situation. She backed off completely from my financial accounts. likely realizing that a fraud charge would ruin her in ways even she couldn't manipulate her way out of. The legal action never made it to court because she knew she wouldn't win. She had lost, and in losing, she had finally, for the first time in her life, experienced what it meant to face real consequences. I cut contact with her completely. I didn't just block her on social media. I erased her from my life. No more messages. No more interactions. No more family gatherings where I had to tolerate her presence. She had spent years dictating the rules of engagement, controlling the narrative, ensuring she was always at the center of attention. Now she was nothing. And my parents? They had a choice to make. They could either continue enabling Emily, clinging to the fantasy that she was the perfect daughter, or they could accept the reality that she had ruined the family all on her own. At first, they tried to stay neutral. They tried to reach out to me, inviting me to family events, pretending as if things could just go back to normal. But there was no normal to return to. I was done. The last time they called, I let it go to voicemail. My mother's voice was soft, uncertain, tinged with the sadness of someone who had realized too late that they had lost something they could never get back. But it wasn't my loss. It was theirs. Emily had spent years believing she was untouchable. She had spent her entire life thinking that no matter how much damage she caused, she would always be forgiven, that there would never be consequences. But she had finally learned the truth. And as I walked away, leaving the past behind, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not relief, not triumph, just peace, real peace. And this time it was mine.